So, as I mentioned in my notes to you last night, what I'd like you to focus on is looking back at your 4 days of your PACT teaching event on how to help students read ads critically. What do you, how would you do them differently were you to start from the beginning and redoing those 4 days? What would you do differently than what you did?
If I could redo the 4 days,
if you could redo the 4 days, correct.
I would take out the written portion of the assignment that I had going. So there was a lot of focus on advertisements, and even though the written portion, I think it's important to know that you can use that skill in tasks other than advertisements or visually. It was just kind of out of left field, or it was quite different because it was advertisement, written advertisement, and it was just kind of it would have made the days easier to plan because it would have I was already over planned anyway. There was a lot of content and I could have slowed it down, and that would have made the 4 days go smoother. Initially, I had too much planned per day, which when I looked at my lesson plans and it was 5 pages long, I realized that it was a little too much for that one day. But I adjusted halfway through and rewrote. And if I could rewrite them all again, I would. Those are the main things. I think I'd take out the writing and even it out a little bit.
And just because people who are watching this video won't know what you're referring to by the written component, maybe you can describe what the written component of that is in relation to the overall objective.
All right, so I did a teacher-led lesson on the first day in which I walked the students through making observations, turn those observations of this advertisement into concepts, and then the concepts wasn't a great emphasis on thematic statements. However, I did include them. For that same day, I'd also planned for the pairs of students, or partners to do the same activity, but with only one other student to help them out. So it wasn't teacher-led anymore, but it was completely scaffolded because I'd just done it with them. What I realized on day 2, when it was planned for day 1, but on day 2, concepts is a much more difficult concept for students for 8th graders to get than I initially thought it was. So I dropped thematic statements. And
my question for you, just to interrupt a little
back
bit.
to the written component.
When you talk about concepts, do you mean what the advertisers had in mind as their, you might say, their controlling concept? The Toyota ad controlling concept might be, we want to associate owning this Toyota minivan with happy families whose kids play
exactly
fun and engaging games on their own.
The observations we were making in the advertisement, we had to directly relate back. The concept we had to relate back to the ad. So, I mean, you couldn't do... we had a RAV4 advertisement with a couple kids playing in it and a mother watching on, and it was very picturesque.
That's what I was thinking of.
You're not going to have like evil be a concept that you're going to think of for that advertisement. But anyways, on this, after the partner work,
the reason for the question is that is quite a sophisticated concept. Concept about concept. It is quite a sophisticated way of thinking, where you're saying, oh, there must have been an idea that led to this advertiser's choice to portray the RAV4 as the RAV4 was portrayed in the setting.
We did an initial kind of pre-assessment as to how students, or what students thought the underlying message of advertisements were.
Underlying message, that was what I'm trying to get at.
And the students had no idea what the underlying message was. The underlying message to the students for advertisement was basically that they're trying to sell this car, or they're trying to sell the product, right? They're trying to sell this thing. And there was nothing about what was actually going on, how they were trying to sell it, what they were making you think about yourself when you purchased the product.
Oh, interesting. So in general, your students were not conscious.
This is why it was so hard. I didn't see this coming.
Yeah.
So I mean, I saw it the day before, but I was I was like, well, maybe this isn't as bad as I think it's going to be.
Right.
Because I wasn't very specific in my questioning on the pre-assessment. I was just, I wanted a vague idea if they knew what the underlying message was. And,
right.
No specific wording exactly.
Yeah. So they really, just to make a distinction here, they're really unclear that there is an underlying message, or or they're unclear
they
about
didn't know,
what the...
they didn't know there was an underlying message. They thought the underlying message was by X.
Yes.
So this was a completely new concept to them.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that's why I ran into a brick wall on day 2.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I had to rewrite day 3.
Teachers, at this time, would you please make sure your doors are locked and blinds are closed?
Just shows that we're really out of school. People are confused.
We're currently on a practice lockdown, apparently.
Yes.
We should be safe, however. It's a little tiny conference room.
Right.
Okay, so where were we?
Just why students might have been confused about the whole notion that ads have underlying messages beyond simply buy this product.
Well, I found that students weren't able to associate, at least on command, ideas with things they see.
Yeah.
So they're thinking very concretely at this point. So it's 8th grade.
Right. So it might be a difference between concrete and more abstract thinking.
Yes.
Yeah, because in high school classes, I notice particularly when ads are quite deliberately aimed at your appearance, usually as a female, but increasingly as a male as well, and how getting this product or that product is going to increase your attractiveness to the opposite sex, or your being in the in crowd rather than the out crowd. That high school students are very conscious of the underlying message, and often quite resentful at the incessant promotion of that.
A lot about the concept lesson. So I'd experienced this lesson before. And
in what context yourself?
I was in a class, and
what year and what?
I was in actually a class at San Jose State, in which it was they were having us go back and observe other teachers teaching, and this was a lesson that I saw done in high school.
Right. Yes.
So
yeah.
Which is why it was easier for them to approach in high school, because they had a lot of the background thinking skills and schema were already in place.
Right.
And so we were building that. So I thought that we were going through and we were creating more ideas on how to critically think, but we were also here like building the structure on how to critically think, like at the basic level. So a lot of the skills that they had in the high school lesson weren't present in my students just because they hadn't had years of experience with it, which is why I had to end up cutting so much out and revisiting.
It might have, actually, the lesson you saw might have been part of the expository reading and writing course, or curriculum as it's sometimes called, which has whole units of instruction that are often devoted to topics like the influence of ads on teenage behavior. But you're quite right that those particular units build you up very slowly and carefully to the point where you're discussing ideas like underlying messages.
So they had a good exposure to it.
Right.
I think your original question was that why would I cut out writing?
No, I was asking you to describe what the writing component. Yeah, because you said next time you did it, you'd cut out the writing, and I just wanted you to be able to clarify what was the role of the writing in relation.
So if I were doing this in high school, I think I'd leave the writing component in. I'd probably build on the writing component more than the final ad component, which I'll explain in a minute. But the written component was a version of where they're making observations about this text, and they were turning those observations they made about the text into concepts. And the goal would have finally been thematic statements as a class, which I ended up dropping anyway because it was just too much. But I would have dropped that this time around for the 8th graders because I think the advertising component was more than enough attempts at building schema for them,
right?
Than applying that straight to this new format.
And getting back to your distinction between at least a form of abstract versus concrete thinking, the actual putting together of an ad, which you had them do the day after I observed you, and choosing what their underlying message should be, that did involve them in that concrete activity, just in the way that you're saying. So I think you're right on target on that. This is one of those areas where probably getting to the more abstract by way of the concrete activity is probably the more efficient way to go and the more effective.
And that lesson was, the final component to the lesson, the creation of the advertisement, was completely new. I hadn't seen that in anything to do with the advertisement before.
Yeah.
And I thought going from... so originally with our deciphering, we started with an advertisement that was already complete, and we made observations, turned them into concepts.
Right.
For the last component, we had these students start with a choice of concepts and a product to sell.
Right. Choice of product, and then 5 different.
Yeah, 5 different options of concepts.
Yeah, right.
And they chose 2 to 3. And those, it was really backwards thinking from what we just learned. So it was a lot of knowledge building there, learning how to apply the process backwards. So you're really getting a grasp on it.
And you had whole table groups doing that together, right? Rather than
a lot of group learning. After looking back, I originally planned the writing component to be individual, and once I found out that the students needed much more practice than I'd originally thought they were going to need, we decided to emphasize practice than like an informative. It was almost like a summative assessment because they're working on their own.
Right.
So we decided to make it much more engaging, as in working with other people, collaboration.